Han Fei lived during the tumultuous Warring States period, a time of great political upheaval and constant warfare. It began around 475 BCE, when the reigning Zhou dynasty was falling apart. Its ruler was nothing more than a figurehead who commanded no real authority over his overmighty subjects. For more than 200 years, the dukes and kings of the various Chinese states jockeyed for position, but it was the Qin who rose to the top, eventually founding the first imperial dynasty in 221 BCE. Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, came to rely on the writings of Han Fei, the great synthesizer of the legalist school, to cement his power and administer his unprecedentedly massive realm. Born a prince in the state of Han, Han Fei was given the advantage of an excellent education. He studied under the great Confucian philosopher, Zhunshu, but Han Fei was a stutterer and unable to discourse well at court. Consequently, the rulers of Han habitually ignored his advice on matters of law and statecraft, even as their state decayed around them, which is a shame because Han Fei was a very clever man and a talented writer. He's credited with developing one of the most sophisticated writing styles in ancient China. However, even his eloquent papers could not convince the king of Han to employ him, and the court grew weaker and ever more corrupt. Han Fei's works were better received in the kingdom of Qin. The Qin king was anxious to meet him and invited him to his court. Han accepted the invitation, but the Qin advisor, Li Si, had studied alongside Han Fei under Zhunshe, and he had always been jealous of Han Fei's superior talents. So when Han Fei arrived at the Qin court, Li Si had him thrown in prison. But Li Si did not stop there. You see, even though the king of Qin was very impressed with Han Fei and had no intention of punishing him, Li Si convinced Han Fei to commit suicide while imprisoned. The Han Fei Zi is Han Fei's most famous writing and laid the foundations of Qin legalism. Han Fei was very critical of the dominant Confucian and Maoist schools, which both based their teaching on emulating the wise and virtuous ways of the old sage kings of the early Zhou. Han Fei argued that the truth of the way of the sage kings could not possibly be known, since they died thousands of years ago and left no treaties of government behind. To be sure of anything without corroborating evidence is stupidity, wrote Han Fei, and to base one's argument on anything of which one cannot be sure is perjury. Han Fei also failed to see the usefulness of ancient doctrines in the modern age. To try to govern the people of a chaotic age with benevolent and lenient measures, wrote Han Fei, is like to drive wild horses without reins or whips. He fiercely attacked the prevailing argument of Confucian social philosophy, that human nature was essentially good and that government should grow naturally from values of righteousness and benevolence. Following his teacher, Zhunshu, Han Fei believed humans were inherently evil and selfish and had to be forced to act against their own base natures by an inflexible code of laws. Furthermore, he thought that even if truly good people did exist, they were of little worth. Like the European Machiavelli, Han Fei attacked the very usefulness of goodness and virtue. The enlightened ruler does not value people who are naturally good and do not depend on reward and punishment, he wrote. Why? Because the laws of the state must not be neglected, and government is not only for one man. Reward and punishment are called the two handles in Chinese government, and Han Fei suggested a ruler rely heavily on their use. The ruler controls his ministers through punishment and kindness. If the ruler abandons these, unless his ministers use them, he will be controlled by his ministers. Han Fei advocated that the law of the land be based on logic, that it be concrete, measurable, and that it be written down. One of his greatest criticisms of prevailing theories of government during his time, especially Confucianism, was that it was based on subtle and unfathomable doctrines, which are no business of the common people. He considered the tenets of competing schools to be difficult even for men of highest intelligence to understand, which meant the common people would consequently find them impossible to understand. Han Fei accused the literati of confounding the purpose of law with their obscure philosophies. He even went so far as to suggest that in the state of an enlightened ruler, there is no literature of books and records, but the laws serve as the teaching. These policies were taken to heart by the first Qin emperor, who used them to administer his new empire like a well-oiled machine with little regard for humanity. Qin Shi Huang is credited with creating what we would come to call China, an empire as large as the Roman at its height, and also the world's first centralized bureaucracy. He standardized the writing system, transportation, tax collection, agriculture, and ordered a written rule of law be followed to the letter in every district of his massive empire. He followed Han Fei in believing that history was unknowable and therefore pointless, and he certainly had no patience for scholars or their subtleties. The burning of books and the burying of scholars in 213 BCE was a direct consequence of these legalist ideas. According to Sima Qian, 460 scholars were rounded up and buried alive at Qin Shi Huang's orders, while thousands of books were thrown on bonfires in the streets. This was a tragedy for history and literature, rivaled perhaps only by the burning of the great library of Alexandria in the West. It is impossible to know just how much was lost by this single act of anti-intellectualism. Due to the Qin's draconian policies, the dynasty fell shortly after the death of its tyrannical founder and was replaced by the Han dynasty, which lasted from 206 BCE to 220 CE. The Han would destroy legalism, eventually raising Confucianism, which the legalists so despised, to take its place. However, the bureaucracy of the legalists and their ideas of a concrete code of law endured. Han Fei's work continued to be studied, and his words to exert influence over the rulers of China far beyond the fall of the empire.